For that warm introduction, and I hope I can live up to that, especially this early in the morning. So this is strange. I can't see the, so is that on the first one? Okay, I guess. So I think what I'm going to talk about a little bit here is, I'll review 60 by 30 very quickly, but spend a little time on the marketable skills goal, because I think that's the one that vexes everybody the most. You know, the first two are pretty straightforward and in some regards pretty simple. And the first one is that by the year 2030, 60% of all 25 to 34-year-olds will have some kind of post-secondary credential. And so defining that is simple. Now getting there is going to be something else again, particularly when you consider that the data shows that our college going rate dropped a percentage point this past year. So it went down. We calculate that we need about a 65% college going rate. In other words, we need about 65% of those folks coming out of high school to go on to college. In order to get to this 60%, that's the kind of rate we need to maintain, and it actually dropped this past year to about 56%. So y'all need to pick up the pace on that one, all right? Or whoever's, you know, whoever's responsible for that. I gave a talk about 60 by 30 at one institution, and the first question I got from the audience was, so what are you going to do about public education? And I had the pleasure of responding with, that's not my responsibility. But it is an interesting thing, you know, because we do need to have that 65% at least coming out of high school and going to college. And maybe even more importantly, we need to have that 65% prepared to go to college. And that's probably harder at this stage than it is to get 65% to go in the first place, but to have them actually prepared to go to college is a whole nother issue. And the second goal, of course, is that by the year 2030, we'll be awarding 550,000 certificates, associate degrees, bachelor's degrees, or master's degrees in that year, and that's solely on Texas institutions. The first one, the 60% by 2030, we will also take, you know, immigrants from wherever we can get them, including Oklahoma and Louisiana and that kind of thing. I can throw Arkansas in there. My mother's from Arkansas, so I can. And she's passed away, so I can now say whatever I want to about Arkansas. But, you know, we'll take them from wherever we can get them, because to help bolster that number. But the 550,000 is the number that we want Texas institutions to be granting. And right now that stands at about 280,000 or so. So we still have a ways to go. It's a 15-year plan, and I'll remind you that we're rapidly approaching the place where we only have 14 years left on our 15-year plan. And then the fourth goal, which is student debt, it's also in a lot of ways very straightforward as well. The idea is that by the year 2030, 60% students who graduate will have a debt that is on a statewide average that is no higher than 60% of their first year earnings. And that is roughly about where we are at right now. So that particular goal is a maintenance goal. And the idea behind that is to simply try to maintain that. So let's see, so hopefully that's the one that has all the, does that have all four goals on it? All right. I may actually be able to remember how I did this. That's pretty neat. But the fourth goal, marketable skills, is the one that I think has actually concerned a lot of people about what does that mean? How do we do this? How do we report it? How is it going to be tracked? And so on. And so let me talk about that one a little bit. And then when I conclude that, then I'll try to give you a couple of other things coming out of the coordinating board that you might or might not be interested in. but they're going to affect you in one way or another, whether you are or not. So you might want to be interested in them. How about that? Okay. So this should be a slide that tells you what marketable skills are. And I think it has the definition on it. Not yet? How about now? Oh. Oh, now we're cooking. Okay, here we go.
We're getting you a monitor.
That's okay. So let me tell you a little bit about where this came from in the first place. Okay, and I actually think the next slide talks about a report from the Georgetown Institute that talks about, no, I'm sorry, a survey that was done in California of college students that asked them why they were going to college. And so what's the number one reason for going to college? Yeah, to either get a job, get a better job, right? Now, most of us in this room as educators, in some sense, that's not necessarily why we went to college, right? Because most of us wouldn't be here if we didn't have some sense of love of learning for its own sake. You know, I tell people, my kids used to ask me all the time, well, you know, so Daddy, so how do you know so much? And it's just because I read a lot. I mean, it's not because I'm a genius or smarter than anybody else. I just read a lot. And part of that is because I just like to know stuff. And whether it's relevant to me or not doesn't really matter. I just like to know stuff. All right? And a lot of educators are that way. And we tend to think our students are the same way. And it took me a while of teaching to figure out that no, they're not. Most of them are not there for that. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't like to learn, that they have some built-in innate desire not to learn, but their reason for being there is different. And most of the time, it is to get a job or to get a better job. Most people recognize, in spite of the fact that higher education has been beat up over the last 3 or 4 years by the popular press, you know, lots of articles about, you know, do you need college, what's college worth, and so forth. In spite of all that, it is still the case that a high school diploma pays more than a non-high school diploma, and a college degree pays more than a high school degree, and so on. And the differences are there regardless of any other demographic, regardless of age, gender, racial, ethnic group, socioeconomic status. The differences in pay over a lifetime, in particular between the levels of degrees, is still there, and it is still more than statistically significant. Right? It amounts to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars over a lifetime. And I told somebody the other day that I'd finally figured out what I want to do when I grow up, and that's retire. Okay? So of late, I've been thinking more and more about this, you know, retirement thing, and how do you do that and, you know, and avoid eating dog food while you're doing it, and that kind of thing. And so finances play into all of this. And the reality is that it's going to be a lot easier for me to retire than it is for probably the vast majority of Americans. Right? In other words, my financial security is much greater than theirs, and a lot of that has to do with the level of education that I have and the opportunities that that's afforded me throughout my adult life. So in spite of all that, the differences are still there, and students still recognize that. And so they come to college to get a job, to get a better job than the one they have. I think all of us have probably had those experiences where you realize that an education can really pay off. I tell people that mine is well, I've had several of these kinds of experiences, but one of them was in high school when a buddy of mine talked me into spending the summer breaking up an asphalt parking lot with pickaxes and shovels, you know, and he thought this would be a great way to make money. And one of the lessons I learned was that, okay, whatever it is I want to do, it was another one of those things I could put on the list of stuff that I was sure I didn't want to do. And that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life breaking up asphalt parking lots. That was for sure. And so, education means a lot. And I remember my dad, when I came home one afternoon from doing this all day long, and he just kind of looked at me, and he never really said much about going to school or anything, but he did make the remark that, if I didn't go to college, I could do that the rest of my life. And that made a real impression on me, as a lot of other things. But so that's why students are there. So the marketable skills goal came out of this sense that students go to college to get a job, to get a better job. Students also should have some reasonable expectation upon graduation that they can get a job, and that they can get a job in something reasonably close to what they majored in, if that's what they want to do. Now, some people go to college and major in things and then do other stuff, and that's fine, but there ought to be at least some reasonable expectation that upon graduation you can get a job, and you can get a job at least somewhat related to the major that you had, or at least that you will come out of college equipped to get a job. And so that's where the marketable skills goal came from. And in its original conception, as you can see, the goal itself is defined as students will graduate from a program with marketable skills. So if I say to you program, what does that mean to you? I mean, what do you think of? If I say your programs ought to have marketable skills attached to them, how do you define programs in your head? Yeah, degrees, almost always in terms of instructional programs, right? So you think about your certificates, the degrees associated with them. Welding is a program. Art is a program. And for those of you that are familiar with the accreditation process, and most of you in this room are, then every time SACS, for example, uses the word program, they almost always mean by that an instructional program. And so the original conception behind this was that instructional programs, regardless of what they are, teach people marketable skills. What we don't do a good job at is identifying for students what those marketable skills are. We sometimes don't even do a very good job of identifying to ourselves what those marketable skills are, but we certainly don't do a good job of telling students what they're graduating with. And I give people an example from my own background, which is all political science. So I have a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD in political science and government. But along the way, I took a lot of statistics. I also, along the way, one of the jobs I had when I was working in college was at a plastics plant where we manufactured trash bags. And they weren't necessarily very good, but we cranked out a bunch of them anyway. And it occurred to me later that the statistics that I learned as a political science major qualified me to run their quality control department. I mean, it wouldn't have been that difficult to make the transition. I would have had to learn a little bit more about plastics, a little bit more about seams and that kind of thing, and how that stuff melts together, for example, when you cut them and so on and so forth. But I learned all that in the production process. And so with the statistics background, I could easily have run their quality control department, and actually would have been equipped to run a quality control department in an awful lot of manufacturing enterprises. So I exited all that with a marketable skill, because that is the kind of thing you can take to a lot of different places and say, look, in addition to having this degree, I can also do this. And that's what this whole goal about marketable skills is about. And frankly, it was originally conceived as a way to try to help out the social behavioral sciences and the humanities, because there has been an awful lot of discussion about the worth and the value of degrees in English and fine arts and so on, because it is not clear to people that those necessarily lead directly to an occupation the way engineering and accounting does, for example. And certainly at the 2-year level, the way that welding and nursing degrees lead directly to an occupation. So that's where this goal came from. And in its original idea behind it, all we were going to do was simply ask institutions to identify the marketable skills that come out of their programs, which really means then the institutions then should ask their programs, what kind of marketable skills are you teaching, in addition to the sort of standard student learning outcomes that are associated often with assessment at the program level, but also what kind of marketable skills are you teaching? What kind of marketable skills are students learning in the process of going through your degree program? Now, sometimes this is really clear, right? And I've had a lot of career and technical education folks come up to me and say, well, you know, that's what we do, is teach marketable skills. Yes, granted, if a student is majoring in welding, then one would hope that at the end of that, if they exit with an Associate of Applied Science degree in welding, that they can actually weld something that'll hold together, right? I mean, that is the idea. And that in and of itself is something that you take to an employer and you say, look, I can actually weld two pieces of metal together and they will hold together over time. Right? My dad was a plumber and pipe fitter, and he taught me a lot about soldering and brazing, but he also taught me a little bit about welding. And so I learned very quickly that I could weld two pieces of metal together easily. Getting them to stay together was much more of a problem. But that's the marketable skill. I can put these two things together and they will hold up over time and with stress and so on, right? But one of the things we know from, particularly engineering has gone through this, and they did this 30 years ago when industry began griping about engineers who couldn't actually talk to anybody else other than an engineer. I mean, apparently this was a real problem in the industry. Great engineers, but had a very difficult time conveying engineering to someone else, had a very difficult time talking to other people besides engineers. You know, every profession has its jargon, right? And so part of what ABET did, which is the major accrediting body for engineering programs in this country, that they started demanding that students not only be taught how to engineer, but they also be taught how to communicate, for example. So there was a lot of emphasis then put on communication skills, both written and oral, for that matter. And ABET changed their accreditation policies to reflect some of that and the kind of outcomes that they wish to see in an accredited program. So, you know, what are marketable skills? You know, and if I'd really been smart, I'd have printed this out, right? So this is the thing about 88%. So first of all, I think we need to make some distinctions between things like employability skills. And this is the how to dress, how to act, show up for your interview on time, be appropriately dressed for your interview, set up straight, put your cigarette out before you go in, don't pop a wad of tobacco in your mouth when you sit down for the interview. Depending on what part of the state you're from, this could be appropriate, right? And that kind of thing, right? So, in some sense, those are what I would think of as employability skills, which is very basic stuff. One of the things, a friend of mine and I were having a conversation about this the other day, and he said that some of this stuff gets lost because more and more students go through and exit high school without ever actually having a part-time job because they're so busy doing other stuff, right? They're involved in 100 activities. They're constantly on the move. They go to school early. They come home late. And they don't really have time to work. And so consequently, they never go through that process of having any kind of part-time job in high school. And they don't really have a job until they may exit college. And so a lot of these employability kinds of skills that are learned sometimes by trial and error, beforehand, gets lost on students. But those are employability skills. So I think those are pretty simple kinds of things, but at the same time, they're also very important. So, I'm sure that many of you have interviewed a lot of people over the years, and there's really nothing more off-putting than someone who comes in, right, and they don't look the part, And so, and I mean, even I know this stuff. I mean, you look at me now and you think, well, what does he know about dressing the part? But anyway. But I have been hired once or twice. So I must have got something right. Okay, so those are employability skills. In marketable skills, so where do these things come from? There are two basic kinds of marketable skills, I think, and one is soft skills, and the other is the so-called hard skills. And so I think that for the social and behavioral sciences, humanities, and those kinds of disciplines, what they really need to think about is what kind of hard skills are we teaching in the course of this, like the statistics that comes with a lot of social and behavioral sciences. But there are other things as well. The Commissioner of Higher Education in Texas is fond of telling people that, his degrees are all in English. But when he moved to California, after getting a bachelor's degree in English at the University of Texas at Austin, the first job he got out there was as a technical writer for one of the aerospace companies there. And so he took all the skills that he had learned in English and then applied them to a technical writing job. All right? And a lot of students exit without realizing that they have those kinds of skills. So if you're in the liberal arts, so to speak, which, by the way, does include math and science, have traditionally been liberal arts as well. One of the things to think about is what kind of hard skills are students learning in the course of what they're doing in here that they can take to an employer and say, I have a degree in English, which means I know these things, but that also means I can do these things as well. And so what are those 2 or 3 things that you've identified? All right. Now, if you're in a more career-oriented, so to speak, I hate to use the term career-oriented. I once had a cardiac surgeon tell me that his whole career was just glorified vocational training. And in a lot of ways, he's correct about that. I mean, you take apart a heart and put it back together again. Believe it or not, there's actually a lot of similarities to taking apart an engine and putting it back together again. Now, you can screw up the engine and you can still fix it. It's a little trickier with the human heart, right? But so there's a level of sophistication there that's very different. But his whole argument to me was, this is just glorified voc tech training, what I do. And he loved it, and he did a great job on my dad. He had a triple bypass, and that was a long time ago. I don't know, 40 years ago or something? No, 30 years ago, I guess. He just had the battery in his pacemaker replaced. So it worked. Right? So he was very skilled at what he did. But for those kinds of things where there is clearly, in a lot of ways, some kind of technical skill that you see there, and this is true of whether it's a welding certificate or it's a doctor of medicine with all of the requisite residency that goes with being a cardiac surgeon, those kinds of skills are obvious, but one of the things you might want to think about is what kind of soft skills are associated with those as well, because soft skills are also marketable. I mean, the ability to communicate well, either written or orally, is, if you think about it, it's not as common as we might want to believe it is. Right? We all listen to people all the time, and you may be thinking this yourself right now, sitting there thinking, so who is this inarticulate mass standing on the stage up there? Right? And when you leave here, you might think, well, what the hell did he say anyway? Well, I know what he said, but what does any of that mean? Right? So think about the soft skills that are associated with this. And one of the things that we've done in Texas is we have associated soft skills with the core curriculum. Okay? If you look at the core objectives associated with the core curriculum, they are what? Communications, critical thinking, teamwork. Those first three were chosen primarily for two reasons. One is because communications and critical thinking is essential to whatever it is you're going to do. If you can read well, you can learn almost anything. Right? I mean, that is the key to learning, is being able to read and to read well, is at least one of the keys to learning. And critical thinking is just as important to that endeavor as you go through life, but it's also terribly important to employers who want people who, we sometimes refer to this as the ability to think on their feet, but the ability to think about a problem perhaps in a different way than it has been thought of before. What are the possible solutions to that? Now, critical thinking is a tricky business, because if we ask, so I think I was told there were like 180 people registered for this. So I ask every one of you to write down your definition of critical thinking, and there are 180 of you in the room. We might well get 190 different definitions. Because some of you will write one down and then go, oh, wait a minute, that's not really it, it's this. Or, well, it's also this, or it's also that. So there's not necessarily widespread agreement on what critical thinking is. As a political scientist, I'm often reminded of one of the Supreme Court justices' position on pornography, which was, I cannot define it, but I know it when I see it. That was ensconced in law, actually, believe it or not, which is why one of the reasons why we still fight over this today. But critical thinking is somewhat akin to that. On some level, we all know it when we see it. We have a sense of whether someone is actually engaged in critical thinking when dealing with the problem or not, as we sit and listen to them or we read what they have written about it. We can't necessarily define it, but we know it when we see it, at least. And if you ask employers what they want from their employees, then what do they tell you? They want people that can communicate, they want people who critically think or problem solve. Those two things are not necessarily the same, but there's a lot of relationship between the two, and they want people who can play nice together. Now, I listed that as one of the employability skills, and that's the sense that you actually know how to get along with other people, at least on some level, at least good enough that you're not causing a lot of tension in the workplace anyway. That doesn't mean you have to be best friends, but it does mean you have to maintain some level of civility with your fellow employees. And so, and teamwork involves a little bit more than that, because that also involves the ability to actually work with other people. And I find this kind of interesting, because how many of you from the social sciences or the humanities? Okay, so in a lot of ways that's always been a very solitary process to a great extent. Right? I mean, when I wrote my dissertation, it was just me and the dissertation chair telling me what was wrong. He never did really tell me what was right, but he was very fond of telling me what was wrong with it. And that's okay. But it's a very solitary process, and as a student, I hated working in groups. Right? Because there's always somebody who didn't want to carry their weight, and that kind of stuff. And I just didn't like talking to other people anyway, and that kind of thing. I've gotten over a lot of that. But it's a very solitary enterprise, and so there are a lot of disciplines out there for which we don't really work on this issue of teamwork with them. So that's one of the reasons why it's a core objective, is that we give students some exposure to that and what that means, and what it really means to work as a team and how to function as one. And then the other three, personal responsibility, social responsibility, those two were really drawn, quite frankly, because the UEAC committee that created most of this in drawing off of the LEAP value rubrics, like the AAC and U, recognize social responsibility and personal responsibility as something that may very well be lacking in the world today. All right? Think about how rampant cheating is, for example. To me, that would indicate a lack of personal responsibility. And maybe even to some extent social responsibility as well. But, so those things, and empirical quantitative is also there in some sense to shore up that work as well. So the core curriculum actually tries to get at some of these skills that we want people to have, but at the same time, we want you to go beyond that. I was asked by one of the more esteemed universities in Texas, by a representative of that institution, said, you know what? So, communications, teamwork, critical thinking, they're all in the core curriculum. One can argue those are all marketable skills. So can I just send you those three as our marketable skills and declare ourselves as done? And so I said, no. You can't do that because we want you to go beyond that. I mean, we've already started the process of trying to work on some of these, but to identify what else is there. I want to point out that this does not necessarily require you to make changes to your curriculum. Now, after you delve into this, as disciplines, as departments, as colleges and universities, you may very well decide to change your curriculum to some extent, to make these things more explicit, to provide more emphasis for them, whatever you identify, but that's a decision that you need to make. So you're not being asked to necessarily alter your curriculum. What we're asking you to do is to identify what is already in there, but you just don't necessarily make it explicit to a student, and then figure out some way to tell a student that they've also mastered these things so that they have some record of this that they can take with them. Some portfolio processes do this already, for example. So e-portfolios sometimes incorporate these things, and they easily can incorporate them. Some professions, art for example, has been doing some of this stuff through a portfolio process ever since anybody can remember. Because in art, I'm an artist, and here's a painting that tells you I am, or here's a piece of ceramics I've done, or whatever the case may be, and you demonstrate that through a portfolio process. So there's a lot of ways to do this. And we as a coordinating board, I have no desire to try to dictate to you what your marketable skills are, first of all, or dictate to you how you recognize those things. But what we expect is that institutions will look at their programs and at least make an honest effort to identify the marketable skills that come from them. And that only has to be 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever you got. There has already been some work done in this regard by the Texas Association of Chief Academic Officers, which is the 4-year school organization for their CAOs and Chief Academic Officers, and they have already looked at communications programs, and they brought together a bunch of faculty from across the state to sit down and talk about what kind of marketable skills are associated with the disciplines in communications. And they've identified some of these things. I saw a draft of this last week. I think they still need to do some work on it. But they've started that process. And what they intend to do with these then is once these faculty work groups sort of identify this stuff, then they intend to distribute this through the rest of the state. And then other programs can just take a look at those and say, yeah, we do those too, or yeah, we do those, we do that one, but we also do this one, and then to use them as they will. Okay, so there's already some work being done with this, but I think it's really vexed people about what it is that we expect from this and what we don't, and I would like to make this as simple as possible. Now, I have been asked the question from time to time of, so let's say that program A at institution X says, our students exit this program with these 3 marketable skills. How do we know that? Well, the reality is the only way we are ever going to know with any reasonable level of surety is by doing what? Yeah, you're going to have to assess it. Now that makes you assessment folks really happy, right? Because y'all just live to assess stuff, right? It doesn't matter what it is. You know, it's like the old military thing about, you know, if it doesn't move, paint it, and if it moves, pick it up. You know, and then you're covered, all right? And so if it's out there, then figure out a way to assess it. Well, we are not there yet. Okay, and I will tell you that my argument internal to the agency and elsewhere has always been the institutions still have a lot of work to do to figure out how to appropriately assess student learning outcomes. And some institutions are well ahead of others and doing a great job with this. Other institutions are not so well ahead of others, but there's also an awful lot of refinement that comes with that whole process. And so, you know, part of my thing has been to say, look, let's let them work on assessing their student learning outcomes for a while longer before we start asking them to assess something else. And if they really get down assessing student learning outcomes well, then they can probably make a transition to trying to assess marketable skills much easier. And for right now, let's just ask them to identify, tell us what they are, and let it go at that. And keep in mind, you have 4 more years to figure this out. So they're all sitting there thinking, oh man, this is great. I'm going to think about this next year, right? I've always lived by the theory that you should always put off till tomorrow, whatever you can put off till tomorrow, because you may very well pass away in your sleep tonight, and then it's not your problem, right? Now, I will be the first to admit that philosophy has bitten me a couple of times because I lived through the night. And you're like, oh crap, now what am I going to do? But I've learned to adjust to that, and actually I've now learned that the probability is I probably will live through the night, so I better get it done. But that doesn't mean I can't wait to the last minute, nevertheless, or almost the last minute. But I would urge you to start thinking about this now. A lot of you have dealt with SACs, and you know, the attitude about SACs is, you know, once they leave, the old attitude, before the beloved 5th-year report came into being, you know, the old attitude was, well, those guys are gone. Let's see, we got 10 more years before, oh, we got 8 years before we even have to think about this again, right? The 5th-year report has cured a lot of that, because at best now you may have 3 more years before you have to think about it again. But as it turns out, it actually pays to keep up with that on an ongoing basis to make your dash to the finish a whole lot simpler than it would have been otherwise. And so I would urge you to really think about this issue of marketable skills, but really focus on your instructional programs. You can also focus on your extracurricular activities that may lead to this. There are a lot of things that students do in clubs and in organizations and in activities outside of the classroom that lead to the development of marketable skills. And to the extent that that's true, then students ought to know what those are. But you know, part of this is designed to try to look at what is it that we're doing that affects everybody. So we need to be touching all students in some way. And I don't think we can leave this strictly to extracurricular activities, because the harsh reality is, good or bad, most students don't engage in extracurricular activities. A lot of students don't engage in co-curricular activities. They go to class, they do their work, they go home. Right? And that actually describes most of the students that we deal with on a daily basis. And so we have to touch them in their instructional programs and through some other programs that we may put them through. There's a lot of talk about, you know, advising and that kind of thing. So that's sort of my spiel on marketable skills for the moment. And if you want to know more about that or have questions about it, then I will be doing a breakout session where you can ask questions. How much time have I got left? Okay. And we may have some time for some questions in here as well. But I want to touch on a couple of other issues Let me see if I actually talked about all this stuff. Yeah, I did. Okay. And one is dual credit. So I think that dual credit is going to be the subject of some interest in the upcoming legislative session for a couple of reasons. As many of you know, dual credit was opened up to anybody in, well, sort of true, to anybody in high school, right? Ostensibly as long as they are qualified, but college readiness is a slippery slope. And what a lot of, and traditionally at least, a lot of institutions have said, if you want to take a course in dual credit, then you have to be at least college ready in at least one domain. You know, so if you want to take English, you need to be college ready in reading and writing. If you want to take a math course, you need to be college ready in math. And we still have rules about courses that are either reading and writing or reading and writing intensive and also math intensive, and arguing that for those courses, then a student should demonstrate college readiness, and that right now the number of options open for being able to do that have been limited quite a bit. About the only thing left now is SAT scores, ACT scores, and TSIA scores. And so we floated a rule back in the spring, and some of you may be familiar with this or not, but this is one of those things, so you run up the flagpole to see what the reaction is, and believe me, there was a reaction. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But so we ran a rule up the flagpole, so to speak. Actually, we proposed the rule and then withdrew it. But the rule would have said that if you want to take any college level course, and this would have applied particularly to the academic side of the house, not necessarily the CTE, by the way. But if you want to take a college level course, then you must have demonstrated college readiness in at least one area. Because we have a lot of courses out there that students can take that institutions do not require those students to be college ready for. So we floated this rule, and I've been at the coordinating board almost 3 years now, and in my time there, this is the biggest reaction to a rule I've ever seen. We received 102 comments. The average number of comments that we receive on rules is probably point something. I mean, most times we don't get any comments at all, which sometimes I find rather fascinating. And sometimes I think, now, you know, somebody out there should read this. But then because, you know, once it becomes a rule, then it's the law. So you probably should have read it. But anyway, now if it's one of the rules I wrote, then it's fine, don't worry about it. But the other stuff people do. But we got 102 comments, and we received 5 comments from colleges. So 5 of those 102 comments came from colleges. They were all community colleges. We received 97 comments from independent school districts or from associations of independent school districts. Okay. And overwhelmingly, they were opposed to the rule because it would mean that some of their students wouldn't be able to take a college level course. Because after all, dual credit is without a doubt the best preparation there is for college. Okay, now thank God some of you are shaking your head. All right, so what's wrong with that statement? Well, it's supposed to be college, right? I mean, that's the whole idea. I mean, the dual credit is a college level course for which a student also may receive high school credit. It is not a high school level course for which a student may also receive college credit. That is not the intention of dual credit at all. But nevertheless, there has been an attitude fostered a lot among a lot of superintendents and principals who then argue that dual credit is the best preparation for college there is. We have one senator who said in a hearing that, you know, if you wanted to find out whether they're college ready or not, you just let them take a college level course. And if they pass, they're college ready, and if they fail, they're not college ready. Well, okay, there's a certain amount of sense in that. And that would work if we could be assured that there would be no implications or ramifications of people failing perhaps vast majorities of their classes. All right? But the reality is, and you know, it's just something the commissioner says a lot, and I think he's absolutely right about this. I mean, a lot of us in this room have taught classes before, and we all know that if it looks like 75% of your class is going to fail, as a general rule, what happens? Well, you tend to blame yourself, not the students, and you start giving extra credit and curves and, you know, and all kinds of stuff, and then you start taking your curriculum and sort of, and let's face it, you know, I mean, we use the word dumbing down. I'm not sure that's really an accurate way to put it, but the reality is that we tend to say, well, okay, so this is a little difficult. I'll start back at the beginning or something. And that's the inevitable results of what happens in a classroom. And this is true no matter whether it's a doctoral level class or whether it's a kindergarten class. That phenomenon has been observed across the board for ages, that we tend to try to arrive at the middle somehow. And we do it not only in the content and the rigor at which we teach, but we also do it in the way we then judge that content and rigor from the students. And so, you know, part of this is if you want to maintain standards somehow, you also have to maintain standards for how you get in the first place. Or otherwise, they will erode over time. And I think there's more than ample demonstration of this. And so part of the concern of this is that if you open up dual credit too wide, and you have a lot of people taking dual credit who are really not qualified to take college level courses, then you face this situation where over time that erodes. And at some point, some college or university out there is going to say, I'm not taking this stuff anymore. And trust me, if one of our flagships goes to the legislature and says, I don't want to take dual credit anymore, then they'll probably get a pass on it.
Rick, how about the four-year colleges that are actually teaching dual credit?
Well, I think the same applies to them as well. The same phenomenon will happen to them as well. They won't be immune from this either. Okay? And right now, about 10% still of dual credit is taught, about 90% of all dual credit is still taught at the community college level. And only about 10% of the dual credit that's taught is CTE, by the way. So 90% of all dual credit taught now is still sort of the academic transfer side of the house. But the same phenomenon would apply to the four-year schools as well. And so, you know, I don't think this is something, yeah, and we would be fooling ourselves if we thought, well, you know, the four-year schools, they'll take care of it somehow. The same thing will happen to them as well. And may already have, for all I know at this point. So there's a lot of concern about whether students are ready or not. The other big concern about this really comes from, so here's what I tell a lot of people sometimes. When we first got into this whole thing about 9th and 10th graders being allowed to take dual credit and that kind of stuff, so I started telling people, look, here's what we ought to do. And you pick whatever grade you want to. After the 8th grade, after the 3rd grade, I don't care. But after every, you know, at some point then, at the end of every school year, we give students the TSIA, or we give them the SAT, or whatever college readiness measure you want to pick. You give them that, they pass it, you give them a high school diploma, tell them good luck, Godspeed. You're on your own, kid. All right? So an 8th grader passes TSIA, now, by all accounts, right? If 9th graders want to partake in dual credit and they need to be college ready, well, if they're college ready, then why do they need high school for? Right? We can save a lot of money this way. Right? Now, I don't want to say this too loud because some legislator will pick up on this and go, oh, save money? Yeah, let's do it. Right? So you already know there is a provision in law, right, that if a student in high school finishes the core curriculum, they get a high school diploma. How many of you knew that? What's in there? So think about that as you plan your dual credit stuff. But people look at me the same way many of you have, right? And that's with this sort of horrified look on their face. Like, wait a minute, what are you saying? Well, and that's actually the response I want to elicit. I'm not really serious about that because the issue also comes up of psychological and social readiness for college, right? Because all we've ever measured so far is their intellectual ability. And we can debate all day long about how well we do that, by the way, and how well SAT, ACT, TSIA is a measure of their intellectual ability or readiness for college, but really that's all we've looked at, all right? Accurately or inaccurately. And we've never really tried to judge whether a student is socially or psychologically ready for college. And one of the things that we've noticed in data is that, as students progress through college, right, their GPAs usually tend to rise. So sophomores, their GPA tends to be, as a group, tends to be higher than freshmen, and juniors higher than sophomores, and seniors higher than juniors. Some of that has to do with the phenomenon of going to college and simply not being ready for college. I mean, I think one of the things that's happened to us over time is that I think when I went to high school, that the transition from high school to college really was a real transition in the sense that it was simply a step from one level to another level. And I think today there is such a difference between what happens in high school and what happens in college that there's a huge disconnect, and that a lot of students who did really well in high school are not really prepared to go to college because that's not what high school was doing for them. And I'm not trying to blame anybody for this. This is an artifact of how we've created public education and so forth. But I think there's a huge disconnect there. And what we see a lot is, and this happens anyway, I mean, this happened when I was going to college. Students, you get out of high school, you go to college, and there's that myth that somewhere between May and June you become an adult. And really what you become is a free adolescent, which is probably one of the most dangerous things in the world, right? And so you take advantage of that freedom. Right? I skipped this for the most part. And by the way, the only reason I skipped it for the most part is because 3 months after I got out of high school, I went in the military. And so I misspent a lot of my youth in the military. But the reality is, I'm not sure that socially and psychologically and so forth, I was really ready to go to college. Actually, I went to college during the summer between graduating from high school and joining the Marines, and it was a less than stellar performance. Okay, I went to college because my dad said, well, you can either go to college or go to work full time. And I thought, man, I've been working part time for years, and that's been no fun. So going to work full time can't be any fun. And so I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to go to work full time. And so I thought, well, okay, then I'll go to college. And besides, I'd heard there were girls there. And I thought, well, how bad can this be? Right? So like a lot of people, I focused on the wrong thing to some extent and didn't have a stellar summer quarter in college. That happens to a lot of students. And I think what we're seeing to some extent perhaps now is students get out of high school and they can go into college as juniors, because they've amassed enough dual credit to do this, either through early college, high school, or now they can do it without early college, high school. And so they hit that wall when they're just now turning 18 or so as a junior rather than as a freshman. And they have a lot less time to recover from a misspent semester, right? And the effects of this may not be felt in their graduation from college, but it certainly may be felt when they try to go on to a professional school or graduate school, and they're competing with other people who didn't do this, whose GPAs are higher, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of implications of dual credit that we haven't thought through, and one of the At the same Senate hearing, actually it was a joint hearing of the House Higher Ed Committee and the Senate Higher Ed Committee, and at the same hearing where one senator said, well, you know, you just let them take college level courses, and if they pass, we know they're ready, and if they don't pass, then we know they're not ready. And it's like, well, yeah, but maybe we should try to figure that out before we start letting them fail stuff. But another senator raised this whole issue of the social and psychological readiness for students, and are we pushing this too far back? It occurs to me that there are also a lot of implications for curriculum with this. Some of you probably heard me recount when I was in a government department, when we first got into assessment, we did pre and post tests. That was our first crack at assessment. We did a pre and post test, and those things are useful, right? And it turned out that the scores on the pre and post tests were actually all the same, pretty much the same, right? But the weird part about it is they were high. Now, what does that tell you? Well, that tells you that these students were actually coming to class and they knew something already, which was a shocker, because we had made the assumption as a discipline primarily that, you know, these people didn't learn anything in high school. So we had to start, I taught government, by the way, and so we had to start government classes at 0. Let's assume they don't know anything, and we'll start at ground zero. And it turns out they actually knew a fair amount of stuff. So what did that mean? That meant that we could then take our curriculum and ramp it up. You can say, wow, these students already have some basic understanding of things like separation of powers, the two-party system, that kind of stuff. And so we can actually take our curriculum and elevate it. Well, if government is going to replace high school government, as it does through dual credit, you cannot elevate your curriculum any longer. You're going to have to take it back down to 0. So there are long-term implications for the way that we teach a lot of these disciplines if they don't get that foundational knowledge in high school, and we haven't talked about that very much at all. That's never really been a part of the big picture. And somehow we've always assumed that they'll get both of this at the same time. They'll get both that foundational stuff and they'll get the ramped up stuff. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't work, we think. So part of what we're doing with this is there is a study underway on dual credit that has 2 parts to it, and this is, we've got about I think we actually have $888,000. I'm not sure how it worked out that way, but from 3 different funding sources outside of the private funding sources outside of the coordinating board to conduct a study on dual credit. And so the RAND Corporation and Gibson, which is a state research body, has been engaged to conduct this study, and a lot of your institutions will be hearing from them over the next couple of weeks for what's called the qualitative piece of this. And they're going to conduct a lot of interviews with directors of dual credit programs and people who oversee directors of dual credit programs to really get some look at how this is being done across the state, who's doing it, how are they doing it, is it being taught. We sort of know this already about how much is taught by high school faculty, for example, versus how much is taught by regular college faculty, full-time, part-time, and so on. We have some of that information available to us already through the reporting that you do. So we're going to look at the qualitative piece, and that's supposed to be finished by December. And then in late spring, the quantitative piece of this, where they really dig into the data that we have. Because there's a lot of concerns about this, and one of the things, as I pointed out to someone else, the concerns are, or the issues that are being raised are legitimate issues, and what we really need to figure out is whether they're also legitimate concerns or not. For example, there was a lot of discussion about people having to retake courses that they'd already taken in dual credit. Well, it turns out that if you look at the data, there are actually very few students who take, or who have to retake courses that they took as dual credit. Now, so that's a concern that it turns out is a legitimate question to raise, but it turns out to not necessarily be a legitimate concern. So we're going to move on and look at other stuff then. But I think part of this is we need to have a good body of evidence behind us before we really start trying to make policy decisions about it. But I will tell you that there are legislators who are concerned about the expansion of dual credit. whether it is too much, too fast. And part of what we hope to do with this study is address those issues. So, we have time for a couple of questions?
Actually, we've got 3 minutes, and Marlon has the mic.
I thought I was going to get away with no.
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back to marketable skills. I am on CTE. And CTE, when we do our program outcomes, we base it on what can students actually do out there that we can teach in here. So when you talk about marketable skills as an additional thing that we're going to have to go back and assess, I'm just kind of curious in terms of how the cohort sees the differentiation between program outcomes and marketable skills.
Well, but let me remind you, first of all we're going to do so right now is ask you to report those things, not assess them. So, I think there may be a distinction, but there may not be. I mean, if you have a CTE program, for example, that already actively engages in communication, for example, then you may already be there. And if you built that in as a program level student learning outcome, it may be that you've already identified a marketable skill there. My sense is that for a lot of programs, there will be some distinction between the two in that, and I'll go back to my own example of statistics. I don't think most political science departments, until recently, and certainly when I was going through the programs, ever considered that the skills they were teaching students in statistics could actually be applied to anything other than political science. Maybe to other social science kind of stuff, but I don't know that it ever really occurred to anybody that statistics can be applied to the weather, to manufacturing processes, for example. I don't know that they ever really occurred to them, in spite of the fact that a lot of our word problems revolved around manufacturing processes. This kind of always thought was kind of interesting, but I never thought about it at the time either. So it may be that there is, I think certainly there may oftentimes be some overlap between the two. And so don't allow yourselves to get too hung up in necessarily saying to yourself, well, I have to identify 3 things that we haven't already identified. Because it may be that you've already identified them, but you may not have made it necessarily explicit that that is a marketable skill. Okay? Does that help any? I hope. Is that it? Okay. One more.
I was curious, you mentioned that this legislative session will be addressing possibly some issues with credit, or you were referring to the upcoming legislative session maybe addressing dual credit. Is there anything particular about that as far as that we need to be watching for, certain councils or Zoom?
Well, not at this point. Pre-filing will start in about another month, and at that time we'll have a better idea if people are going to actually try to address this through legislation. I think what you may see is some concern about the expansion of it, and it may very well be the case that, and I think part of what we're going to try to argue is that we probably need to be very careful about the expansion until we finish some more study with this and really have a much better idea of how this is actually working out there. And is this truly benefiting students, and is it benefiting their long-term prospects or not? So, it's kind of iffy at this point. What you may see is a sort of, well, let's stand pat until we get more evidence, or you may see some efforts to back off on the expansion a little bit.
And one other question, you mentioned that one of the research that showed that, you mentioned as an example, I think actually, that students
looking at students if they had to retake courses or not, was there a difference in dual credit core classes such as the academic side versus the tech courses? We're a tech program, so if they had taken something other than English or math, and a class related to that, was there a difference in the percentage of having to retake?
Well, our first pass at this did not try to disaggregate on that basis. And part of that is because, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that only about 10% of all dual credit courses are CTE courses. So 90% of the courses that are being taken, and by law, you're only supposed to offer dual credit if it's a core course, if it's a foreign language course, or if it's CTE. So that leaves your 90% with core curriculum courses and foreign language courses. So by far the vast majority of courses that are taken out there are core courses. And now as we go forward, and I'd have to go back and look at, they're still working out some of the protocols for the quantitative part of this. But one of the things that we've started doing is trying to make some distinction, or draw a better distinction between sort of the academic transfer dual credit and CTE dual credit on the other end, because we tend to conflate the two things, and they're, as you all know, they're not necessarily the same by any stretch. And when you consider the fact that a lot of CTE doesn't necessarily require college readiness. So just as an aside to all this, we've started this program, a study initiative, where we're really trying to align curriculum in associate of applied science degrees, which are vastly, they're much more screwed up in a lot of ways than the academic transfer side is, but for a lot of reasons that I can go into later. But, you know, and part of that is to look at and ask the disciplines themselves, so does this particular discipline, whatever it may be, welding, nursing, you know, whatever it is, does it require college readiness? What level of college readiness does it require? If it requires any at all, and to try to make a better distinction about that. Because what we've done is we've sort of made the shift in our minds that if it's offered at a college, then it must be college. And that's not necessarily true. I mean, UT Austin, which probably has the, you know, the highest admission standards of anybody in the state, and it's the flagship institution and blah, 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 blah. You know, the reality is that they do stuff that's not college. They have a continuing education department. There's a lot of people that go through it and they take stuff that's none of us would ever think of as being a college course. And it shouldn't be. But part of what we've done in our own minds is we've made this shift in our heads that if it's offered at a college, it must be college. And that may not necessarily be the case, and that may not be the best attitude to take when it comes to students. Oftentimes a lot of them who are just trying to get a job and make a living wage. And we need to be very cognizant of that as well. So I will end it there, and if you